Hello, Extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else watching. Welcome back to the half hour, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Iranian protests and all of the fun anti-government stuff that's been going on. As per usual, my name is Spencer.
And I'm YuYu.
And yeah, we've got a fun episode today. We're going to talk about a couple of different things pertaining to this. If you guys are new to the podcast, the first things that we do is we do a little bit of housekeeping. We talk about just some general things you need to know. Then we provide you with some background info. Typically it's me, then YuYu, but today it's going to be YuYu, then I. We're going to go with some possible questions, and then the show will end. YuYu will have this fantastic outro. It'll be amazing. Trust us. It's style quality.
Let's dive into the background. So I'm starting first today because I will give you a little bit of history and a little bit of what's going on right now and a little bit of how people feel. And Spencer's going to talk about theory, like always, but that's okay. It'll be fun. So I'm sure by now many of you have heard about the protests going on in Iran regarding the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was accused of improperly wearing her hijab by the morality police, or some people will call them the guidance police. She was brutally beaten and sustained horrible injuries while in custody and eventually died in custody too. The Iranian government said that they were going to investigate into her death, but basically videos have surfaced. Everyone's basically aware of how brutally she was beaten and how bad that she was treated when she was in custody. So that is like kind of the main reason why her death sparked outrage among Iranians and led to mass protests in the streets of Tehran. And protests were not just only in honor of Mini, but also reflected long-held opposition to the state's rule. So I'm sure many of you already read about the protests that are happening both in Iran and also worldwide that stood in solidarity for the women in Iran. So women in Iran were burning their hijabs and taking to the streets to protest, and Iranian security forces have dispersed crowds with tear gas, metal pellets, and sometimes even live fire. And Iranian women aren't the only ones that are protesting. Like, it's the girls in schools, it's universities, students in the universities, and it's also like men, boys, and adults alike kind of protesting and taking it out to the streets. Like, this also shows you that while on the surface it is a protest about like women's rights and gaining justice for Amini, it's also a lot of it has to do with the way that the government has been treating the citizens as well. And so while justice is deserved, Iranian protests run deeper than just women's rights. It also ties to general public unrest with Iran's theocratic state and its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. NPR stated that a series of mounting crises have festered and helped fuel public rage, including the country's political repression, ailing economy, and global isolation. So not only is it the women and adults that are protesting, it is everyone else that has some grievances held against the state or just generally suffering in their livelihood in Iran. So protests originally targeted the morality police, which is the group that heavily polices and focuses on targeting women in Iran, mainly in the sense that they are not following kind of Islamic codes of conduct or morals that they want to uphold in this theocratic state. So the morality police's main role has been to technically police all people and ensure they remain in line with the code. But of course, that's not really the case. They have a focus on women specifically and they target them specifically. But not only that, but since they're employed by the state, they are kind of like an extension and reminder of the regime's failed policies and lack of resources, along with the authoritarian dictator-like behavior that is happening within Iran that is sparking all this protests and all this outrage. But let's dive deeper into why the people are upset. So tensions have existed already for quite a while. For example, in 2009 and even further before that, but like in 2009, there were protests in select areas regarding election fraud. And then more recently in 2019, there were protests against the like the decrease of subsidies on gas prices and food that made it tougher for citizens to afford those kinds of things, and general economic decline that the country was facing too. And there are other things that happened internally that added more fuel to the fire, but we both suggest that you research on your own. But just for this purpose of this episode, tensions have existed for a while and have mostly been aimed at the regime's harsh actions and what feels like a lack of care for their. There are many factors of why Iranians have unpopular opinions about their government. The main issue that has consistently caused discontent is how their economy and policies are hurting the livelihoods of citizens who remain. And Iran's economy has suffered from massive hits from failure to secure the US Iran nuclear deal, leading to US sanctions on the state, leading to a drop in their GDP, failure to diversify their trade, and to reduce kind of their reliance on oil as their main economic funds, or I guess like main economic revenue, and also the failure to weed out corruption as well has cost them and their economy a lot too. But like further on in that, like to add on to that, like along with the effects of COVID, Iran really hasn't been in a good spot for quite a while, and especially with just these recent protests and kind of the brutality of the police forces there, it's kind of just like hit a breaking point and caused widespread massive protests and not just protests in select areas. But the Iranian forces have also fought back as expected. So fighting back against this political dissidence, they use violence as their key tool. They've arrested protesters, put them into security detention centers, forced them into complying with the state by threatening their safety and their family's safety. They've also been, with their actions, that's why they've been condemned internationally for their behavior and human rights violations. Further, the morality police are still policing women, with the most recent disappearance of Elna Rakabi, who is an athlete that lost her job in the middle of competition in South Korea. When she returned to Iran, she was said to have disappeared, and no one knows where she is right now, which is just like only another indication that policing there is driving people like towards fear, and also kind of the repressive nature of the state at the moment because of these institutions that have been like instituted by the theocratic government. Other than that, though, like the worst of it is that Iranian forces, and not just like polices, but like Iranian security forces of the state, has been employed to fight back against this political dissidence in really violent ways that have led to many deaths of protesters just out in the street. And there aren't even clear numbers, as like they've tried to shut down the internet, so there aren't really a lot of reports or any like clear ideas of like what the numbers are for the deaths, how many people have died, how many people are targeted, and who has been targeted specifically. So it's all around been a really bad situation for these past 3 weeks. But as you can imagine, many are in favor of getting rid of Khamenei for his repressive policies. So Khamenei's main goal in ruling Iran has been to maintain their national Islamic values and identity while also opposing Western influences. And that's mainly why the state blames the US or other countries for inciting chaos and domestic unrest. They also tended to blame their enemy, like Israel, for also inciting unrest in the country and causing all of this like violence to erupt in the streets. But because of that, like people are not happy with him and will not align with kind of like his views of, like hating on the West and not really agreeing with their values, because he hasn't really had a good track record for ruling Iran anyway. Other than that, he also had goals of making their economy rely more on international trade with countries like China and Russia, while also rolling back food and gas subsidies. So he has failed in many ways to kind of fully implement his policies. And at the moment, due to like health issues, Khamenei is also currently contemplating his secession of power to another leader, but hasn't really like chosen yet specifically. But yeah, overall, like policies haven't been able to fulfill the promises that he promised when he originally took this position. And the people have kind of had enough of all of this, especially with like the death of Amini, which was really uncalled for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm realizing this now, that kind of transitioning from YuYu to my section actually is a lot smoother than I anticipated, which is even better. Because this is all going to kind of relate in one way or another. Something that's really important is one of the biggest mechanisms for regime change typically is economic collapses, and what's going on in Iran is a very good example of that. So typically when the economy isn't doing so hot, people get really frustrated, and it causes this likelihood of which a economy is, or when the economy isn't hot, it creates a likelihood in which people become more interested in trying to change the regime, right? Like, the thoughts of doing so persist for some time, but it really takes that economic collapse. It's probably the biggest indicator for it. But once we get to today's question, this part of the podcast where I'm speaking is probably irrelevant, give or take, but it's really good when we're asking a different question. And that question would be, how likely is it that these anti-government protests will result in a regime change? More specifically, how likely is it that these protests result in democracy? And I think for the most part, these are questions that you may get in Extemp. And I think they're pretty fair questions based on the nature of these protests, as these protests are focused on changing that of the theocratic authoritarian regime that exists today. The one thing I will say is I hate telling this to my friends on Instagram who continuously post about this problem and are incredibly passionate about it. And I find this to be a very passionate issue too, because I'm studying it at the same time. But the unfortunate truth is that these protests will likely result in little to no change at all. And I'll explain why here. Like I said, this is probably a question that you may get about whether or not and how likely these protests are to change the regime. So let's explain how and why countries transition and apply it to Iran. And the best way to do this is to look at a comparison of the Arab Spring. And for those who don't know, the Arab Spring was a massive democratic movement in northern Africa and the Middle East. Several countries protested authoritarian regimes and wished to pursue changes that would lead to democracy. Some countries did transition, others did not. The one we are going to focus on specifically from the Arab Spring is Egypt, as it provides the most prevalent example. This theory is relatively complicated, so I want to keep it simple. And basically, regime change is likely when there is an increasing demand for democracy. Over time, people develop self-expressive values that reflect autonomous beliefs and eventually lead to wanting change from the current status quo. This typically happens as a result of socioeconomic development. And that's exactly what's going on in Iran. You have developed a ton of self-expressive values that people want to have as and people want to have individual autonomy, right? In the instance that you described earlier, right, with the woman being beaten to death because not following just normal code in terms of Iran, this is the thought of autonomous belief and essentially gives that implication that we want to have self-expressive values, and that creates a demand for democracy. That's usually because of socioeconomic development. Prior to all of what's been happening with the economy, socioeconomic development has been rising, thus you have in fact seen economic development. It's just now it's crashed, and that's usually what results in the change. After this occurs, there is usually what is called a revolution that leads to a period of chaos. Iran is currently in the period of chaos, so they are in revolution. That is what these protests show in terms of this theory. Yes, Iran follows this theory pretty well, and it's a pretty good example of it. But Iran is quite a unique study point, and it helps to really judge whether this theory is right or wrong. So I'll give you the credit of always wanting to tell me that my theories are wrong, or the theories that we learn are sometimes not always right. But this is a really good example of testing whether the theory is true or not. Periods of chaos do not always reflect a change to democracy. Rather, they can actually prevent it, or it can sometimes lead to something worse. So the theory that we're going to use is called the actor-based theory. And essentially, it is all based on actors. It's just as simple as it is. Developed in the 1980s, it was by two political scientists by the names of Guillermo and Philippe Schmitter, who've come up with, well, what is known as the actor-based theory. I'm going to provide the book in the description, or in the sources list, but I don't recommend reading it because it is super brutal. It's a hard read. The theory is rather complex, but let's just point out the one main factor that decides it, and it's the military. Keeping it short and simple, if the military is independent of the regime, so it's not aligned with the regime, it's not aligned with the people, then democracy becomes more likely. If the military is aligned with the regime, so it's essentially part of the regime, then democracy becomes unlikely. Just a side note, there are countries where the military is not attached to the regime, and that is what we mean by an independent of the regime. Not all countries' military are like that of the US where it is aligned with the government. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Most of the time when we talk about things that are aligned with the government internationally, we're usually referring to the police. In the case of Egypt, the military was independent of the regime. Once protests broke out, the military stayed out of the protests. On the backhand side of things, protesters and the regime worked together to cause the Egyptian president to essentially resign and flee the country. After this, a military coup took over and the democracy until a new constitution could be written. The question of, do coups cause democracies? Yes. It's usually if the military is independent of an authoritarian regime. However, in Iran, the military is not independent of the regime. Instead, it follows the orders that are given by the regime. This means that if the regime wants to stay in power, then it will use the military to stay in power. The military upholds to the interests of the regime. Egypt's military could not do the same. Iran's military follows orders by the government, which means that the protesters are not as likely to get their wish. Thus, the military keeps the regime in place, and it is likely to return back to the status quo. There may be some changes. Consider the status quo as probably what it will remain. There is a third outcome to this. Iran could likely end up like Syria. In the case of Syria, the military was aligned with the regime. When protests broke out, there was no change to a democracy. In some instances, as we've talked already, this means that there would be a return to a status quo. But in the case of Syria, it resulted in a bloody civil war that is still going on. Essentially, the civilians picked up arms and then fought against the regime for their rights. And let's just point this out. Syria is not the only case of this. Libya is another prime example. It is possible that civilians in Iran end up picking up weapons, and that is the start of what would be an Iranian civil war. So you'll know if we have to do a podcast on an Iranian civil war whether this happens or not. But the point of the matter is there's really only two outcomes that will happen, and the first one, and the one that admittedly would be the best outcome with the military being aligned with the regime, is some kind of change or some kind of status quo, some kind of similarity to what's happening with the status quo, with maybe some change. But the theocratic regime is probably not going anywhere. The other outcome is what would be a long civil war, and I don't think that protesters are that interested in that right now, but we'll have to wait and see. So, what does this all mean for regime change within Iran? It is probably unlikely. While the human rights abuses against peaceful protesters are atrocious, and both you and I can agree to that, the best that we can really hope for is that things do return back to normal. Otherwise, Iran is going to be in a very nasty situation. And YuYu, and I know we talked about this a little bit beforehand, the fact that this can end up in this matter is admittedly pretty scary. And I know of not a couple people who are Iranian.
I think you make a good point. Like, things look really bad right now. Tensions are really high. We really don't know like the exact status of, like both the supreme leader and also like the government of Iran, and whether or not they are like strong enough to sustain this really massive wave and push towards a regime change.
The question is, why is the Iranian government struggling to stamp out recent protests? Let's kind of just start with a discussion. The reason why I liked this question, and I think you might be on the same boat of why you like this question. I don't know if you told me you did or you didn't, but we're going to assume that you like the question. Hey, she might tell us no in a moment. One of the reasons why I think this is a good question is because this is a very different question than what you might see in Extemp a lot of times. once again, why is the Iranian government struggling to stamp out recent protests? And you could probably agree with me on this. Where in this question does it allow us to have an opinion on a speech? This is a very straightforward, like, this is a factual speech that you are giving. And yes, there might be like a couple of different reasons why, and it's up to your choice to determine what are the most important ones. But we're looking at the causal factors as to why the Iranian government is not stamping out these protests as well as they are, right? Or as well as they could be, per se. One of the particular reasons, and this is a side thing, but one of the reasons why I like this question is because I got a question like this at Strix in my junior year, and it knocked me out. Like, this question is really hard, and it's a little bit trickier than a lot of your other Extemp questions, which is why I'm glad Extemp Central had it this week, because I'm well aware these questions are a lot more difficult because you're so used and accustomed in Extemp to give these yes or no answers. But now you have this question of why. And now you're giving a speech that's not based off of like opinions from different sources. It's now based off of facts and the background pertaining to it. Am I missing anything?
No, I think you outlined it pretty well. Like, I do like these questions, so you are right. I think they're just like a little bit easier to go about answering because they don't force you to form an opinion. And I don't know, like, I never really thought about, oh, I don't have a yes no question. Shoot, what am I going to do for my speech? I'm kind of just like, instead of saying yes or no as like an answer to the question, I really just like outlined my 3 points in my answer to the question. It's like really easy for you to do that. Like the way that you answer the question is the 3 points that you have set up to support like the claim behind the question, which is like Iranian government is struggling to stamp out recent protests and you're providing reasons as to why that is. And so like those questions seemed like pretty intuitive to me. It's kind of just like identifying what key phrases and words that are used in the question. And in this instance, it's a why. So you're really looking for reasons and not like opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a topic, or this is a question that I think, and this is one of the things that's really important, I think, for extempers when they get a question like this. These questions stand out in rounds, like a lot, because the judge is accustomed. If you get a question like this is one of those questions that can really make your speech phenomenal or really screw you over. Like, I don't really think that there's an in between on a question like this, partly because it stands out so much from the rest of the questions. We could be asking, like, what should the Iranian government do to stamp out protesters? What will the Iranian government do? Or will the Iranian government fall, right? Like, there's all these questions that we could be asking that could be based off of more of like an opinion of yours based off of the evidence that's. But now we've got a question that's, we need this information. Just what is this information and why is it happening? And I think in a lot of instances when a question like this shows up, it ends up it stands out so much in a round for a judge. And I know, as I've judged before, I've gotten questions like these from extempers, and the first thing that comes into my head is, okay, we've got a descriptive speech about this, and the moment that the speech moves into opinion territory, if the extemper starts talking about these opinions, this speech is no longer answering why. It's now answering what or how should. And that's kind of that's the name of the game, right? Is why. It's not what should or how should. If you're trying to answer this with like, if you want to give an opinion, that's great. Save it for the conclusion, right? Like, you give the 3 points and then you say, like, this is what in the conclusion you say, this is what the Iranian government should do. That's a great way to wrap up your speech. It's a phenomenal way to do it. It's just, this is one of those questions that makes or breaks it. I don't think when I've gotten a question like this that I've given like if there was a 6-person room, if I've given a 3 or a 4, it ends up being high or low. And I think when I've done Extemp and I've gotten a question like this, it's the same thing. It's very difficult to get a middle spot with this. It's make or break. So I would say we're gonna this is a good like walkthrough of this, and we're gonna kind of give both of us will give an answer to this here in a second. But it's one of those questions that I think you use right. It's easier. There's actually a lot of bits of this that are easy, but you got to keep the opinion out until the conclusion. And if you give the and once you give that opinion in the conclusion, keep it short, because the moment that the speech turns opinionated is the moment that I think this ends up getting the rankings get really poor on these questions. They're just there's huge standouts in rooms, and that's good. Pick them if you're good, if you end up liking them, if you do really well on them, excellent. But yeah, unless if YuYu has anything else to add, YuYu, I'll give you the honor of answering the question first.
Yeah. So I guess like a couple things. When we say like opinion, we don't mean like your angle of the question. We mean like you're basically saying, oh, the Iranian government should do this. I think in the context of this question, it's kind of silly to be like, leave out your opinion, because I don't think there's going to be anyone that's going to be like, oh, the Iranian government should do this to enhance their crackdowns. Think about like the question in its entirety, just like why is the Iranian government struggling to stamp out recent protests? There can be different angles that you can take. So there could be like, well, the leader is currently ill and has not shown his face in a little bit, or that the government is currently struggling to tamp down protests despite its violent methods. Or it could even take on the route of like, well, the government is not struggling to stamp out these protests. And then you would give like reasons as to why they're not like able to stamp out these protests. So like you could take different angles and have different reasons, but just don't ever give like an indication of what they should or shouldn't do, or why they should and shouldn't do things. More just focus on like why this particular situation is happening. So I don't know if you've ever like thought about history papers, but like think of it as a history paper. Like, why is this situation happening? And answering that question. But to start us off, so I would say one of the biggest reasons why the Iranian government is struggling to stamp out recent protests is because of like past built up tensions up to the point of almost no return, where the government hasn't been successful economically, like hasn't been able to do well in trade, hasn't been able to do well in like managing US Iranian relations in which sanctions are lifted, and hasn't been able to do well to like both protect Iran from COVID's huge ramifications, and also like recovering from COVID's ramifications as well. And like the second thing to like why they're struggling to stamp out the protests is kind of like the determination and motivations behind the protesters themselves, and like what really fuels them to protest. A couple of the articles that we link down below mention how youth are a really big part of this movement now, like university students and also like elementary students, because they feel a sense just nothing to lose. Like they don't really have anything to lose if they don't like go and protest. They feel that like everything has been taken away from them and there's nothing left of themselves to give except doing everything in their power and whatever in their power to like incite change or incite a regime change or make sure that Khamenei is taken out of power. And so like those are a couple of avenues that you can pursue in terms of answering this question. Another like way to answer this question too is kind of like the weakness of the government structure itself at the moment in terms of like gaining control over its people. And you could do like a historical analysis of how it was a different situation maybe in the past, but then it was a new situation, or like it's a bigger and newer situation in present day, to where it kind of like weakens the ability of the government to then crack down on these protests as harsh as they could in previous years.
Yeah, like you said, taking different angles, right? Rather than taking a different angle. I think one of the biggest ones, and you don't necessarily have to fully look at history. You can still look at like current present stuff, right? I think definitely one of them is for certain gonna just the authoritarian regime itself and its actions against the protesters, right? This can fuel protesters more. Hey, if you're going to take these violent actions like what the Iranian government is doing, hey, then what happens is you get protesters or protests that become bigger, They become essentially stronger. You get more young people involved, right? Okay, that can be part of the reason as to why the Iranian government is struggling, because the protesting group is getting stronger, right? It's a sign of protesters want to ensure that this regime is going to change now because of what is going on now, right? Think about how it all started, right? It all started as a result of some person or some girl getting beaten to death, right? Because, hey, that is a result of the nature of the regime, and because of that, people started protesting, and the more violence that ensues, the more people that will protest. Once again, you can take like some comparisons are never bad in a speech like this either, right? Egypt is the same way. Even though Egypt resulted in a different outcome, right? Egypt had a similar start. Egypt started with what's called the April 6th movement, and essentially people in Egypt spread message to start protesting based off of violent actions by Egypt's police force, right? Once again, police is what's aligned with the state in Egypt. So, in the instance of Egypt, for example, the more violent these got, the bigger the protests became, and only fueled the answer for protest, or the fueled protesting more. And that's kind of the same idea here, right? Violence is a mechanism. Violence by an authoritarian government is by far one of the reasons for why people will continue to protest against the regime. Okay? And as violence continues to ensue, people are more likely to continue protesting, and you're more likely to have more protesters, making it difficult for the government to stamp out protesters.
Yeah, that's definitely like a big point and something I like mentioned in my section where if you are really like cracking down on citizens, of course, it's like a way to fuel their purpose and to like fuel their anger even more. Like they're already protesting about the brutality of the regime itself. And if the regime is just like reinforcing that idea, then of course it's like adding more fuel to the fire and like motivating them to continue protesting. I think like there are other avenues that you can take with answering this question. Like you could mention the fact that eventually Iranian government's brutal crackdowns on these like protests will result in the protests being squashed and nothing to result of these protests. Like that's definitely an angle that you can take on like the flip side of this question in terms of like why the Iranian government is not struggling to stamp out protests. I guess I'm trying to think of if there are like any other angles that we might not have like covered, but could also potentially be a response to this Extemp question. You have anything, Spencer?
Well, I guess we could kind of tie the theory in a little bit now that I think about it, right? Like the demand for democracy exists now, right? You have self-expressive values, and that we do know across democratic change that self-expressive values are like one of the biggest indicators of it. The change in how you think, right, is really one of the biggest factors and biggest motivators, right? Because now instead of people looking up in Iran, for example, instead of people looking up to their god for food and water and for basic life, part of what they ask for that basic need is the government. Think about how much that changes, right? Hey, and that's one of the key changes as demand for democracy increases is the way that you think. You think a lot more toward the self, right? You think you want more autonomy. You want these other changes to happen in society. Okay? So one of the reasons why the Iranian government could be failing to stamp out these protesters is because the protesters have developed the values necessary to have the demand for democracy. And they're not going to quit until democracy gets achieved, right? So the building of self-expressive values essentially has made it in a way where protesters are just going to keep they're just going to keep going because this is what they want. This is what they believe in. They want a government that represents them. They want individuality. They want to be able to do things the way they want to do them, right? Their values become a lot more secular in a lot of ways. And I think self-expressionism is a really good one to this as well. With that, I think you are taking a more of a theoretical take. I wouldn't recommend it, but it is a good answer nonetheless, because suggesting and saying that these changes in self-expressive value have definitely led to a disregard for the government, right? The government saying, oh, we're going to stamp or we're going to stop these protests from happening. Well, if there's a disregard for the government, right, and you want to think for yourself, then of course you're going to keep going, right? So self-expressive values is definitely a key indicator to this as well. That's a more theoretical approach, though. So that's another way you can take this. You can make that angle, right? Yeah. I don't think there is anything else, but for the most part, like, this is why I kind of said it's kind of YuYu's episode, because YuYu's background really hits it, and kind of the point why we chose this question is, if you listen to the background of these episodes, the why question basically is associated with YuYu's background. And that's why as we've talked about this, it's a lot more based on the fact. It's a lot more based on, like, you can take different angles to it, as we just showed, but it's evident that it's based off of what has happened, right? That has led to this point, and what is happening that's not causing this to go on, right? And compared to most of our episodes, these aren't questions we get to answer a lot, because Extemp Central doesn't give us these questions all the time. We want more of these questions. We miss these questions. They're fun.
I mean, I like the should questions too. But yeah, I think like I don't really have anything else to add. Basically, what Spencer said is listen to my section and ignore his. I'm just kidding. Listen to the whole episode. We know it's a long one. We're both still kind of like getting back into the groove of things. College is hard. We might hate our lives, but it's okay. We're getting through it. So thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I hope you get the one in the round. If you don't, let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either Spencer or me, or even like our social media, at the Half Hour Extemp podcast on Twitter and Instagram. We're also available platforms. So follow our socials, definitely do that. And if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, we would highly suggest that you do. It shows us that you are supporting us and you want us to continue in our endeavors forward. And also make sure to like this video and don't forget to ring the bell so that you don't miss a single episode that we post, because we post it a day early on YouTube rather than on One Clap. Go support One Clap, go support your speech and debate teams, and support everybody else around you, because it's this loving and growing community. Thank you all so much for coming into the second season with us, and we hope you'll stick around for more.
Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, we will see you all later.